Hey gang, it's Neil Whitman, and welcome back to my sheds for another deep dive into trying to understand ourselves, the world, and the search for meaning in a different way by examining the foundation stones on which we have built our worldview. And this week, we're going to do two things. The first one is we're going to look at Wall Street bets and that whole phenomenon that was very much in the news in the past couple of weeks, although it's been conspicuously absent for the past few days, almost like there was a decision made not to exacerbate the problem for Wall Street by informing others of what's going on with that. So we're going to look at that, and we're also going to look at something which I've been covering on my biblical series and kind of tie these two things together with a look at the life of somebody in the book of Judges. So anyway, just to start with, we're looking at Wall Street Bets. So Wall Street Bets is a Reddit group, not something that I am personally engaged with, but I do actually hang and talk with quite a few blokes who actually were involved in the whole adventure. They identified that there were a few significant finance companies which were seeking to short sell GameStop. And like I said, there's a few other film company and a few others that they were looking at as well. And basically what took place here, and you'll get a far better explanation of the mechanics of all of this stuff if you just look for it on YouTube. I think Shapiro did a great little 10-minute segment if you want to look at how the thing works and understand what short selling is and how Wall Street Bets sabotaged it. But that's not what I'm here to talk about. I'm here to talk about understanding how to take that. So the trust funds basically invested in the gamble that these companies were going to fold because of the market pressures, because of coronavirus restrictions, that we're going to close these box stores or you know mall stores, I suppose, oftentimes. So they identified that this is probably going to collapse, and they thought that the stock value of it was overpriced, and they decided to invest and gamble that the price was going to go down, and they could make the difference on these borrowed stocks when they actually sold them. And of course, the Reddit guys identified that this was happening and said, "Now let's all buy GameStop stock." And by doing that, they hyperinflated the price of the stock and kind of artificially infused capital into GameStop to make the stock go up several hundred%, which then puts the short sellers in a terrible spot because they either have to buy the stock that they borrowed at the higher price, which is going to lose them billions of dollars, and I believe some already did that, or they're stuck holding on to it, and then they can't use that capital for anything else, and they're only hoping that the stock price deflates again, and that they can at least break even or take less of a loss, but the whole time that they're doing that, they can't use that to make other money, which is the whole purpose of a financing corporation or company, right? So they're really stuck with this, and it's been pretty significant in its impact to the markets and a few particular Wall Street firms. Now, the question we need to ask ourselves when we're examining this is watch the response. Like, if you've been paying attention at all, the response to this is largely gleeful and delighted that these Wall Street fat cats who are just corrupt and abusing the system, and they're vultures preying off of the destruction of capitalist companies, that it's a good thing. And ironically, it's both the left and the right are crowing about how great this is and laughing as Wall Street burns, because they consider this to be a good event that has taken place. And it's not hard to understand why, because if you kind of look at short selling, it's pretty distasteful stuff. We could make a pretty good argument that it shouldn't be legal in the first place because you're gambling on the destruction of capital and making a profit by kind of deceiving the people you've borrowed the stock from, and projecting that you're going to be able to then buy the stock for less than you borrowed it at, and so on and so forth. I mean, the mechanics are kind of weird, but it's not super complicated if you want to look it up. The point is that we see that as not something admirable. And realistically, it's probably reasonable to speculate if a company's investing several $billion in the failure of another company, isn't that probably going to give them some impetus to make sure that company fails and the stock does go down? I mean, if you invest, like you see that whole Shark Tank thing where there's people pitching their business ideas to investors, right? And the big investors, well, if they're going to put money in that company, they're going to help it succeed because they want their money to increase in value in that company, right? They're going to invest time and effort and energy into the success of the company they've invested in so that their capital grows in value. Pretty basic stuff. But if you're investing in the collapse of a company, doesn't it also logically follow that if you could get away with it, you would invest time and effort into the collapse of that company so that you can profit? And so it's pretty reasonable to be like, this seems like something that's kind of corrupt and probably has a fair bit of corruption attached to it. And so we look at that and we're like, that's bad. It's not good. Don't like it. And if these Wall Street Reddit clowns with their weird hashtags and names can make them all look like fools, those people that we kind of see are using loopholes in the system corruptly to their own benefit and to the detriment of the advancement of our economy, that's a good thing. We got them, right? But it's not that simple. And the reason it's not that simple is because even though we love vigilante heroes like the Robin Hoods who steal from the rich and give to the poor, we need to think through, why are we actually happy? And is this actually going to be good? It's not just about destroying something bad. Destroying something bad is not inherently good, right? It is only inherently good if you are in the position to replace it with something better. Does that make sense? And so it's fine to say, Robin Hood in Nottingham Forest, well, the people were being oppressed, and so it was good that he was stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. Okay, yeah, fine, he was breaking the law, but the law was corrupt, and he was providing for the starving peasants who were being abused by stealing from the rich, and that seems good. Maybe it's good, because why are they collecting all that money in those taxes? Is it not to support, the export of those taxes to the war efforts in the Crusade kingdoms in the Middle East, and where Richard the Lionheart is off waging war and his supposedly corrupt and weak brother has taken the throne and is allowing, terrible abuses of the population, and shouldn't we overthrow that and seek to undermine it? Maybe, but are you actually going to make things better by what you're doing, or are you only going to exacerbate the problem? Like, we have to think this through. Is something that is unjust then dealt with righteously when we destroy it? Well, let's kind of explore that. And what I want to explore is the motivation. What is the motivation that is driving the effort? There is this concept which we are quite familiar with, even if we aren't thoroughly read in on exactly what was written about it, and that is the concept of the will to power. It's a Nietzschean concept. So Nietzsche proposed this as a way of describing something. It's not like he invented it. He's describing something that he observed in human nature, and it is the will to power. And he looked at it. We often think of Nietzsche and will to power in a pretty simplistic way, like as though he was saying that might is right and those who have power should use power, and the only good thing in life is to have power. And he kind of said that, but his view was quite complex. He actually described the will to power as best expressed when you did, and he didn't believe in morality, so it's not like good and evil here, but he thought, generally speaking, that the most powerful expression of the will to power was when you, through kindness, won people over. And when you change the world through using art as your form of power or philosophy, and that you could have powerful impact on the world by striving to have impact, and that there were better ways than just using the might is right, militaristic, tyrannical approach. So it's not that simplistic, but essentially what was being said by Nietzsche is something that we, I think, fundamentally understand, is that there is a force within us which just desires power for power's sake. And that because, of course, Nietzsche said we've killed God, we are his murderers, and we need something else now. And if you've killed God, and he, by the way, wasn't exactly saying that God wasn't real. He was kind of saying that we have killed our ability to know God or believe in him. And to an extent, I'd almost agree with him. And so he's trying to replace it with something that can be used profitably for the furtherance of the human race, and, ultimately towards that kind of drive to the Übermensch that he so longingly desired in the replacement for deity. So is will to power a sufficient force to drive us to progress? Is the desire simply to have power a profitable thing? And the answer is not simple or obvious, maybe, but you have to understand something, that when you choose to exercise your will to the pursuit of power without a higher principle to govern it, it cannot possibly be fulfilled in the things that you're doing. Because there's no ceiling on power. There's always more to be grabbed hold of. And if your only driving force is to have power and influence in the world without principle, something that I talked about in my biblical series, right, is that a king must have a king. That we all must have a king. We have to have a ruler, a guide, a god, and we will. And it'll either be ourselves, or it might be another person, or it might be an ideology, or, it might be God. And the thing that you serve is going to be expressed in the way that your actions are carried out. So, is it enough just to seek power? Well, now I'm going to take you through a quick story from the Old Testament, and it's found in Judges. It's the story of Abimelech. And my biblical series, I kind of have been following along, and this is the next person in that series, so if you're following that, you'll maybe recognize him. So Abimelech is the son of a guy named Gideon. Gideon was one of the men who saved Israel. He was kind of a coward, but he rose to the challenge, and he led the people, and he led them in defense of their land and driving out the enemies who were oppressing them at the particular time when that was taking place. And the follow-on effects of that were that the people asked Gideon to be their king and to have him and his sons rule over them. And he said him and his sons after him to rule over them. And he said in response to that, no, God is your king. I can't be your king. I'm not good enough. And then he he said, but you can give me a bunch of gold and silver if that's cool with you. And they did. And then he made an ephod, which is like a priestly garment piece, and a bunch of people worshipped it and yada yada. But the more important part of this story is that Gideon became corrupt. He lived to an old age. He had a good life, and he was probably basically still a decent person in many ways. But it says then that he had 70 children because he had many wives, and also that he had one son through a concubine in a place called Shechem. And so that son is Abimelech. And then you kind of fast forward and it says, and then the people basically became decadent and started worshiping other gods, and bad stuff happened. And Abimelech, who was Gideon's bastard son, went to his mother's people in Shechem, which is in southern Israel, and he says, wouldn't it be better to be ruled over by me than by those goofs up in Shiloh in the north of Israel, Gideon's sons? And they're like, yeah, that sounds good, because they don't take care of us properly, and they're not looking after our best interests. But if the king was from here, he'd make our interests first. That seems like a pretty good deal. And so they gave him a bunch of resources, and he hired a band of mercs and thugs, and he went up north and went to his father's household and killed all 70 of his brothers minus one, the youngest one, who escapes. And there's no great comeback for this kid, but he does bellow out a few curses at Abimelech and then carries on to another country to live in exile. And Abimelech ends up ruling the kingdom. But then it says he ruled terribly, and he was a tyrant and a vicious man. And this is an interesting story because it tells us a lot about human nature. It falls into the biblical account in a very particular way. It has a meaning. If you read the book of Judges, it's not a history book in the classical sense that we would understand it. It is a moral tale derived from historical events. So was Abimelech a real person? Well, I believe so. But the point of his story isn't telling you that he was king for 3 years. It's telling you that there is a problem. And you can tell this because there is a moral that is constantly repeated through the last half of Judges, and that moral is there was no king in those days, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. It's calling to the need for a king, and Abimelech was a king, but it's demonstrating it can't just be any king. It has to be a good king, and that the good king should have been God is presented in the story. Okay, so Abimelech, bastard kid, not treated with the respect that he deserved as a son of Gideon. The sons of Gideon are seemingly ruling over the people of Israel, even though Gideon had refused that position. At least they're holding authority, and that seems to be quite evident that they have authority, at least in the curses of his youngest son who escapes. Is there injustice going on? Probably. People tend to corrupt when they have power and influence. There's evidence of that in the end of Gideon's life. So, yep, they're probably not very good. Not 100%. So what do? You destroy it. It would be better if I were in that position. It would be better if one of ours was in that position. One of us. Because when one of us gets into that position, they'll remember us. Right? That's the deal. That's the rule. That's what we tell ourselves. That those people are bad who are in charge. Whether it's of the economy, of our business, of our military unit. They don't do it right. And it's a fascinating thing, by the way. I've watched this time and time and time again, that every couple of years a battalion gets a new commanding officer. And I'll admit that I have even participated in it, not proudly, but, we all grow. But something that I realized, even myself doing, was identifying over a couple of years all of the flaws of the commanding officer. Like when he first came in, you're like, yeah, this guy's awesome. And then, well, he doesn't do this thing well, and he doesn't do that thing well, and he doesn't pay attention to this area. And before long, everyone hates him. Like, not everyone maybe, and not every CO is widely hated, but by and large, some class in that battalion is going to be like, not a good boss. And then they look to the next boss as their savior from the last boss, and then he comes in and he's different, and they're all like, yeah, everything's great. And then you start to see his problems, and then you realize that it's not a problem of that guy, although some are better than others, obviously. It is a problem of power exacerbating your flaws, and we all have flaws. So, like, I wasn't a perfect commander when I was a company commander, and I think I tried to understand what my faults were and to have people who would tell me when I was exercising those faults and try and fill in the blanks for me. But man, we all got them. And if you were in that position of authority, like, it's probably not going to be better than what's happening right now. And the other point here is that somebody who is wounded and angry by being oppressed is probably least able to enter into the position of their oppressor and replace them without becoming an oppressor. Particularly if they're seeking power to escape the injustice and for no other reason. Because that's a fundamentally selfish thing. We have a will, and that will can strive for power, but if that is not surrendered to higher principles, it is only ever going to be the power to subjugate and destroy. Even when it comes down to art and philosophy, what you are going to find is that if you have not subverted your will to power to higher principles, that even your pursuit of art is to try and force others to conform to your worldview and not to convert, build up, and bind up the wounds of what it is to be a human and the weaknesses of humanity. You just want to force other people to conform to your worldview. I mean, you can see this in so many different examples that, if we're going to take one off the top that's an easy target, it's the LGBTQ community that has all of their to call it a community, whatever, that's what they call themselves. So I presume that not everyone, I would think, identifies with that community idea, but in the main, yeah, they're pushing a message which is, you must respect me. You must respect me. You must approve of me. You must accept my lifestyle. And everything that I say is about you accepting what I am and that I am right. But the right's no better, right? Like, the message on the right is, when it is not subjected to higher principle, that you are all a bunch of leftist idiots and you don't understand anything and you're all insane. And if you don't accept that I am right, I will do whatever I can to try and force you to accept that I am right. Burn down the building, right? Let's burn it all down. It's not about the money. Some people just like to watch the world burn because it's broken. Yeah, it's true, man. It's true. There are Abimelechs, and Abimelechs like to burn the world down. And Abimelech did, by the way. So he reigned for 3 years, and he was a bastard child, and he was a terrible leader. And when he led for a little while, people got angry, and then there was a rebellion being plotted against him. One of his mates told him about it. He set up an ambush outside the city where they were. They came out to fight him, and he annihilated their force with his mercenary bands that he'd hired. And then he drove them into the city, and then he killed everyone in the city the next day. And then he goes to their tower fortress where the noble soldiers and refugees had fled to. And realizing it's a stronghold that cannot easily be laid siege to with whatever limited non-existent siege equipment he had. Like, you got to think this is 1200 BC here, or something like that. And so he grabs a bunch of brush and starts piling it by the wooden gate to this tower with his men, and then lights it on fire and burns all the people inside to death. And then he's so keen about how fun that was that he decides there's another affiliated town who hadn't actually risen up in rebellion against him, but, they're a danger, so let's go do the same thing. And then he does. He goes and he burns that town down, kills everyone, goes to the tower, their keep, their final fortification, and he goes to start setting brush by the door. And obviously the people had heard what happened down south, and a woman drops a millstone, one of those big stone donuts, somewhere between 50 and, I'm assuming not one of the big oxen turned ones, which are sometimes like 500 pounds, but 50 to 100-pound millstone, probably a hand-turned one, drops it off the tower, hits him on the head, crushes his skull, and then he cries out for his armor bearer to stab him to death, which the armor bearer does. And he asked for that so that no one will say that he was killed by a woman. And then the author of Judges kindly records for all posterity so that everyone in the Judeo-Christian world for the last, 5,000 years, or no, 3,000 years or so, 3,000 years or so, has heard the story that he died at the hand of a woman. So, didn't get his wish. Haha. Right? Justice. Great. The problem here is that Abimelech was driven by a will to power, but he had not subverted his will to power to anything beyond holding power. So that can only destroy. And we've seen this so many times that we ought to be wise to it by now. But some pretty simple examples that you might be familiar with are like the French Revolution, right? The Reign of Terror, we call it. So, yes, the kingdom, the monarchy of France was corrupt, and it abused the peasantry. No question. It also abused the middle class. As a result, there was a secret coalition of folks, Danton and Robespierre being some of the leaders, who strove to overthrow the kingdom and foment rebellion and pass messages. And, this is A Tale of Two Cities, Charles Dickens, if you maybe had to read it in school. Love that book, actually. There's, you should have heard about this in history. It wasn't a good time. They did overthrow the king. They killed him. They put him in the guillotine. And Marie Antoinette, who famously said, let them have cake when they showed up at the palace and in a big mob. And of course, it's not actually what was construed as. Like, she was seemingly just telling the steward to give them our food supplies, let them have the cakes that we have, and feed them if they're that hungry. And, whether it was fearful or compassionate is irrelevant. It was construed into, the queen doesn't even understand that when they're asking for bread, that she just said, let them have cake, because she assumes she doesn't even understand what scarcity is. That's how corrupt this world is. And, of course, they overthrew the monarchy. And then very shortly, Danton was killed in the guillotine by Robespierre for not being willing to go far enough in the Reign of Terror and executions. Robespierre was then killed by the others on the Revolutionary Committee and sent to the guillotine himself because he was too much of a threat to their power. And by the way, the world was bathed in blood over the whole countryside of France, and life was not better as a peasant. It sucked. And the people who replaced the monarchy were just worse than the ones who had been there. Not even because they were corrupt, but because they were incompetent and corrupt and self-centered. Because they weren't driven by a principle beyond, I don't want to suffer anymore. And that's not good. That does not lead to healing and growth. That leads only to destruction. And that revolution was ended when Napoleon Bonaparte, basically an Italian mercenary, blew up a crowd that was charging at the parliament and took over as emperor. And then he drove the French people into countless wars and bathed the whole continent in blood after striving after his own power and his will to power. Good times. I mean, not just the continent either. I mean, the Napoleonic Wars happened here in Canada, in the States, and they happened between France and England all across the globe, wherever their colonies were. And it was a bad time. Did not create the desired outcome. You might look also at the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. Were the Tsars bad? Yes. Corrupt? Yes. Did they abuse people? Yes. Was it good to overthrow them? Didn't turn out to be, no. Notwithstanding that there was a higher principle driving both the French and the Russian revolutionaries, that principle was to be ruled by themselves. It was actually deliberately to reject God and religion and to be ruled by themselves because those religions are corrupt. And they were. Yeah, the Catholic French, very corrupt. Russian Orthodox state church under the Tsardom, very corrupt. Yep. Bad stuff happened. And then we reject God and we rule on our own. It is the will to power of man. We will defeat it. We will rise up. We will take the place. And it was a catastrophe of nearly unequaled proportions of cost in human misery, suffering, and life of anything that could possibly be found in the histories of man. Now, the 30 Years' War probably compares. It actually probably was worse in terms of total cost of suffering. There aren't many. And when you subvert justice for personal gain, it does not tend to work out well in any circumstance. So I look at Wall Street bets, and by the way, the people who start the revolution almost inevitably end up getting killed by the people who take it over and then use it for their own gain. Castro managed to pull it off, probably because he exported Che Guevara and had him assassinated in another country, but it's neither here nor there. But yeah, it generally does seem to go that way, because when you take by force, you have established the principles by which rulership may be taken, and others will follow your rules and the way that you played the game. So Wall Street bets, is it good? I'm going to say no, it's not. It's destroying something bad, probably. I would think it's bad, personally. It's attacking something bad, but it is not following any guiding divine principle. It is not subjecting itself to higher authority. And it doesn't have any mechanism to replace Wall Street that it is seeking to destroy, right? Like, what kind of economic system is Reddit going to impose upon North America if it subverts the one that we've got, however messed up that it is? I don't suspect it will be a very good one. Now, maybe this could turn out well, and this will result in legal action and legislation which is going to prohibit short selling, and these guys will just make off like bandits. And if you were in Wall Street bets and participated in this GameStop short squeeze, and you made some bucks and got out, then good for you. You achieved what you're looking for, and certainly I'm not calling you some kind of monster for that. What I am saying is that celebrating it as though this was a savior and a good thing is being myopic. Like, we need to evaluate what we're trying to achieve. And destroying something bad is not good enough. You cannot accomplish good by destroying bad. You only create other bad. The only way to create good is to strive for good and follow good means to do it. And I'm not saying necessarily that were this a morally motivated action, that it couldn't be subverted to positive social change. I'm saying that it's not. Like, this whole thing is fundamentally not. Reddit, I'm sure individuals, and ironically, probably from both the extreme left and the extreme right, are participating with strong ideological ideas of why they are doing it. But it's not a uniform movement, and it can't possibly function to create a better system on its own. So it's just smashing the works and expecting that the grown-ups are going to fix things behind them. And that's not a fundamentally good and productive thing. I don't think it's catastrophic. Like, if hedge funds are destroyed in the United States, I don't think this is going to be a major big deal, although it's not going to be positive. Like, put this way, the corrupt financiers and Wall Street are corrupt, and they're out entirely for themselves, but they're also probably quite Machiavellian with their application of economics and don't want to destroy the whole system they're profiting from, even though they will eventually if they're allowed to continue corrupting it. The Redditors who got the money probably aren't going to be using it in the main productively for the advancement of economy, you know? So removing $7 billion of capital from a hedge fund, putting into the hands of a bunch of blokes all around the world on Reddit, good thing? Let's call it neutral at best. If we want to strive for good things, we need to subvert our efforts and our desire for power to a higher principle that will guard us against destruction. And you might look at examples historically of people who have destroyed the status quo that was corrupt and created something better. But I suspect that you're being very gracious to them in your evaluation and one-sided if you can identify such folks. I don't know who they'd be. You know, there are guys like I talked about in my last video, William Wilberforce, who not through destruction but through legal actions in Parliament and advocation and organizing the kind of advertisement and marketeering of the idea that slavery was bad and encouraging the spread of that message, created a groundswell movement in England that ended slavery there after 40 years of effort. And that abolition spread throughout the globe. And ultimately, thanks Abe Lincoln, the idea started in London and spread there and made it almost necessary, ultimately, whether Lincoln came along or not, to enforce abolition. Like, if you want something to stick, you need to subvert it to higher principles and morally seek to make those changes. Smashing the works with no plan to replace it is not the way to do it. It's like, this is one of the basic principles, I'm sure, in every realm of business or organized anything, but in the military, I think one of my earliest lessons was never challenge the plan unless you have solutions to offer to it. You don't go to the boss and be like, wow, this plan is dumb, we're all going to die. And he says, well, how would you do it? I don't know. No, you say, sir, have you considered the possibility of doing it this way? So have a plan, have an alternative way of doing things, and then push for that in a way that actually obeys the rule of law so that your opponents aren't justified in just breaking the rule of law themselves to revert what you've just done. It's kind of like all these past presidents. Like, Obama didn't have support from the House and the Senate to do all the things he wanted to do, so he did everything by executive decision, which was all immediately revoked by Trump. And then he did all these things by executive decision in the last 2 years, which, of course, then is immediately revoked by Biden, who is now doubling down and doing more executive decisions than anyone ever. And, you know, if you can't play it proper and get it done proper, your work is not going to last. So you got to follow, you must subvert your desire to moral principles and obey this fundamental Christian principle. I don't care if you're a Christian or not. This is true, that you are to love your enemies. You are to give water to those who are thirsty, food to them when they are hungry, and in so doing you will heap burning coals upon their heads. If you take upon yourself, extra legally, to take vengeance upon your enemy, you justify the injustice that they have committed against you by your action. Right? And if your objective in taking power is to smear your enemy's face in the mud to justify yourself, then you've justified them as well in smearing your face in the mud. You really do, like, this principle is true, and I've actually seen it very practically work out, that if you simply don't engage in the fracas, but you consistently maintain the moral high ground, generally speaking, you're going to win. It's going to hurt, but in the long run, you're probably going to win. I'm not saying you don't fight for what's good. You absolutely fight for what's good, and you fight hard at whatever cost. But you don't let yourself do it covertly and destructively. You do it positively, and you play the game right. And then no one can accuse you of having accomplished it unjustly. And if your opponent continues to attack you and smear you, and you don't reply in kind, you make them the bad guy. It's that simple. And then in the long run, you defeat them that way, because increasingly others will start to sympathize with your position. This is the way, the Abimelech way of, I have been treated unfairly, those fools up in Shiloh, those scumbags that are ruling over us and oppressing us, who don't recognize my legitimacy, I'm going to make them pay, and I'm going to kill them. When you do that, then other people say, I don't like the way you're ruling, and I guess the way to deal with this is I'm going to kill you. Don't burn down the building. Do the hard thing and renovate. That's kind of my conclusion on that conversation. So I'm sure this could generate some interesting conversation. I'm sure I missed all kinds of stuff, and I'm sure that probably lots of guys are going to want to have a different opinion about this thing. And I'm more than happy to hear it in the comments and to respond to you. Peace out. Great chatting with you again. And perhaps we'll be back in the not too distant future. Adios.